Richard, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming, Tom. Thank you for the invitation and for putting this event together. It's always good to talk about Orestes Brownson, or as I say, the unjustly neglected Orestes Brownson. So why should you care about Brownson? And I think that reduces to one question. I think, what is America's actual constitution? So I think currently we're laboring under three constitutions. We've got the Founders' Constitution, we've got the Progressive Constitution, and you can think of it as a third constitution, but it's also, I think, at least dialectically related to the Progressive Constitution, and that's the hyper-liberal Constitution as well. Brownson confronts something rather dramatic. He confronts the Civil War. And during that war, he loses two sons who fought on the Union side. He had been engaged publicly in a lot of essays about slavery and the Constitution, about the expansion of slavery into the territories. What could the Constitution require? One biographer says that he visited with Abraham Lincoln in the White House, urging him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation much earlier as a war-fighting effort. So this meant a lot to him. And while we have not lost a substantial portion of the male population to fighting, as Brownson observed, he comes to grips with this tragedy. In his book, published in 1865, The American Republic, which he says is his most mature work of political reflection. So Bronson's writings number something like 20 volumes, each volume over 200,000 words. He just incredible human being, and his ability to work, write, and research. So in the American Republic, he confronts what he says is the real meaning of our Constitution. And he comes to an interesting conclusion, I think, if you think about the Civil War and as we understand it. He says the Republic came apart because those statesmen at the time, and for many decades preceding the Civil War, didn't understand the true nature of our Constitution. They had reduced it to, he says, starting in 1825, to pure democracy. That is pure majoritarianism, trying to stand on top of each other to get power and then to inflict pain on your opponents. That had become, he said, the received wisdom. He also says it had been reduced to individual rights alone and not the full Republican dimension of what we had received from the founding and from our history. And he also articulates these ideas, not necessarily in Aristotelian language or Thomistic language, but it's hard for me to think about Brownson as someone, and as, when Brownson kind of leaves the left in 1840, becomes a convert to Roman Catholicism in 1844, that's when he begins his education over again. And one of the first books he says he reads is Aristotle's Politics. And he's also very well versed in Aquinas. The common law is a huge part of his learning as well. And so he brings this to bear. So he speaks about politics, I think, in a very Aristotelian, Thomistic manner. And he says that we're going to think about American constitutionalism. We've also got to think about these great contraries that are within the constitutional order. So we've got tremendous national power, yet the power of the states. We've got to synthesize that and think through that. We've got a republic about individual rights, but also the just authority of the government. We need to think about that. We've got separation of powers. What's the full truth there? We've got social contract. This is also, he says, a problem. Not that he rejects the Declaration, but understanding the Declaration in pure modern social contract terms, he thinks is deeply problematic. Sort of like Alexis de Tocqueville in that regard. So he wants to put these things together. And in putting those together, he says, how can we become a constitutional people again? And he has really two foundational ideas in that regard. And one of those is, he calls it the providential Constitution or the Unwritten Constitution. And then also another idea, territorial democracy. And I thought I might just walk through those and then sort of ask the question, because he says this is the way back to the Founders' Constitution. This is what we have to recover, this understanding. You can have a written constitution, and we do, but it ultimately has to be felt and lived by the people in terms that are unwritten. And so when I say the providential Constitution, Brownson isn't necessarily talking about divine intervention in history that you can identify. But what he is saying is that the providential Constitution is America situated, has the culmination of Western constitutional thought and practice. That is to say, all of the freedoms and the ways in which men and women in the West have understood themselves as constitutional people comes together collectively in our experience. So when we think about this, Brownson grounds our written Constitution not in the service of abstract natural rights or autonomous individualism, but in the providential Constitution. And what he's saying there is the written Constitution cannot emerge from nowhere. It couldn't just emerge from the creation alone of statesmen's minds. It's going to be dependent upon the various givens that will limit and direct what is possible for statesmen at a particular time. And the givens that shape the written Constitution are not oppressive constraints, they're civilizational accomplishments, Brownson says, that will make the written Constitution possible. So providential, in this sense, means to be guided by what one is given, by custom, tradition, philosophy, theology, and prior political experience. So to comprehend the guarantees of American constitutionalism requires the incorporation of its unwritten Constitution as both historical and a philosophical articulation of the meaning of the written constitutional order. To quote him, there must be for every state or nation a constitution, anterior to the constitution which the nation gives itself, and from which the one it gives itself derives all its vitality and legal force, end quote. The constitution of the state is given to a people who constitute a republic in a particular territory or geographically delimited place in the world. The unwritten constitution is found in a people's political culture, mores, customs, disposition, and peculiar talents. The constitution of the government is built on this assembly of order and connected to it forever. So the authoritative law of a particular country can't be viewed outside the context of the unwritten constitution. No government that is built to stand the test of time can be a merely willful construction that defies the historical, spiritual, and cultural materials that have been given to a people. So keep that in mind as we think about the progressive constitution. The unwritten constitution grounds the written constitution by limiting the range of potentialities it can develop and manifest. These limits also provide reasons for affirmation of an architecture of devotion to a country's actual constitution, its way of life. So this particular or political way of thinking recaptures something of the Greek polis, but with the Christian addition that each of us is more than a citizen through our relational devotion as creatures to the church. The American Republic is also to be distinguished from the tribe in its devotion to a common good that's much more than collective selfishness. And the American idea of the providential Constitution places our particular country under the universal, yet still relational and personal God. And I think Tom was sort of hinting at this, something that's crucial for Brownson in leaving sort of liberation Protestant theology. So he comes to this understanding very clearly that God is free. And God is free, and God is personal, God is relational. And that necessarily informs his own understanding of who he is as a human person and his own freedom. And man being sort of a singular exception within an otherwise natural clockwork universe. And he starts to understand what freedom is, where it comes from, what it's grounded in, and what its purposes are, and that man's personality, the best understanding for that is going to be that it's, it actually finds its best image in God, who is relational and personal. So this sort of wipes the slate clean of thinking you're going to reform the world with sort of a Gnostic socialist idea. America's written constitution, and we think about it, the unwritten order, Brownson says it's the common law heritage, which is throughout the United States Constitution. The colonist practice of self-government for 150 years prior to the Declaration. Religious pluralism. The colonies as separate and then unified political actors in war. Brownson says the Articles of Confederation failed because it was an immature political document. It was a wartime document that didn't actually reflect the unwritten constitutional order of the people, and that fuller political articulation happens in the Constitution. We also have immigration patterns into a democratic society. And so these immigration patterns, already you're seeing an assimilation pattern take place that is, obviously non-hierarchic and obviously given over to a society of work, of effort, of achievement in that regard. Colonial resistance to and gained independence from an empire that had abused historic common law rights and its own tradition of limited government. So the legacy of the revolution and what it was fought for and what it was fought to do. Our framers, Brownson says, built as statesmen. And as such, they drew from all the sources that history, philosophy, political precedent, religion, and the rest of our civilization had given them. So also, if you think about the terms that I've just listed, they require balance, articulation, deliberation, and compromise within Republican government. The providential Constitution requires that, deliberation and judgment about the means to make possible republicanism. What is religious pluralism? What does that mean at a certain point in time? What does federalism mean precisely for the national government, state and local governments? What about the common law tradition? How should that shape constitutional and economic freedoms? What about the tradition of limited government itself? What does it mean as we continue to govern ourselves? And so, my co-author, Peter Lawler, great scholar of Orestes Brownson, he uncovered, one example of this would be the debate over the Declaration of Independence. Inside both Jefferson's draft and then the Continental Congress debating it. And there's tremendous movement back and forth. One of the things that happens is Jefferson's nature's God, or the God of the Enlightenment, the God of the philosophers, is complemented through legislative deliberation with the God of the Christians, or the providential God, the personal God who comes in with two mentions at the end of the document. That's legislative deliberation, making space for everyone, making a much broader space and a much fuller articulation of citizenship than either party could have achieved on its own. That's an aspect of our heritage that we have to develop. Providential constitutionalism, in one sense, means bringing together in one comprehensive self-understanding the partial truth of all the human understandings of freedom that have been discovered in the history of the West. In Bronson's eyes, taking responsibility for the American Republic is in the service of the truthfully differentiated dimension of the free and relational person. This relational person with economic, familial, political, and religious dimensions to his being is more truthfully differentiated than the ideological depictions of individuals who either understand themselves solely as a part of some social or political order, or as sovereigns or self-sufficient individuals who proclaim their rights at the expense of any obligations they might owe to others around them. The privilege of liberty, if we take Brownson seriously, cannot be divorced from relational responsibilities because no individual flourishing occurs outside of a relational context. Complementing the unwritten Constitution is the notion of territorial democracy that Brownson recommends as the modern political temptation of either hypercentralization or excessive individualism. Territorial democracy is Bronson's way of expressing what is the irreducibly Republican dimension of every free political order. Political loyalty pertains to the way of life shared by a particular people, occupying a particular part of the world. The idea of natural rights if stressed to the detriment of obligations, as so many contend, makes the very idea of legal borders seem unjust. Free individuals should be directly open to each other in an unmediated marketplace, freed up from the rent-seeking of political force and fraud. But the truth is that we embodied beings necessarily find ourselves at home in particular places, and even natural rights to become effective have to be secured by a particular order. Political order, Brownson adds, is ultimately about justice, a good that is shared in common, as opposed to the selfish loyalties demanded by tribes, tyrants, and dislocated individuals. Brownson dismisses from Republican government abstractions like the sovereignty of society or of individuals creating government from a putative state of nature, making government an artificial rather than a natural institution that flows from man's sociability. Power, Brownson responds, is a public trust, not a form of obedience to either majoritarian suppression of particular liberties or to the endless rights claims lodged by autonomous individuals against society. Instead, it is ordered to the demands of a shared political enterprise that emerges from man's social nature. The freedom of the person that territorial democracy supports accounts for the richness of personhood, as seen in man's spiritual, political, familial, and economic relations, which must be supported and protected by the authority of the state. Brownson says that a good polity will connect and reconcile the free and relational person with self-government and law, and thereby engender devotion to the common good. Citizens occupying a particular part of the world, joined together by borders, law, and defined accountability of rulers to ruled, is what makes Republican government possible. So Bronson's territorial democracy as a political order is not open to ongoing redefinition by majorities, nor is it created purely by consent. Principles of popular sovereignty, equality, and majority rule operate within the context of territorial democracy. One way of thinking about this, practically speaking, is if you go back and you think about the Brexit debate in 2016, the case made by exit or by leave was we have a country, we have a history, we have a republic, we have our system of law, our culture, and our borders. And it's good. And we know what our obligations are here. But that is constantly threatened, constantly subject to redefinition by endless expansion of an open borders regime that we're in with the European Union. And it's not just migration, it's also law, it's ongoing commerce that we may or may not want, or what have you. Well, we want to get some control over the situation and become England again, or at least an England defined by British representatives who are directly accountable under law in this country to citizens. So that's, if you're kind of like puzzling and maybe my presentation was too abstract, that's a way to think about it. It's also, I think, a way to think about what's going on within a lot of the member states of the EU right now. They also are wanting, although they might not express it as such, as territorial democracy. The term itself comes from former British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. So what happens if we lose our providential constitution and territorial democracy? What constitutions do we get in turn? So one would be, I think, the progressive constitution that has been engaged now for over a century to redefine our constitutional order, succeeding in various ways, but of course, not yet fully. And so we kind of know what the progressive constitution is, right? I think a foundational disagreement with the founders' constitution. Woodrow Wilson, assume a fictitious national unity that exists. Why does it not exist? Woodrow Wilson says, well, because of a lot of private interest and because of divided and separated government. We don't know where accountability is. We have no effective centralized power. We have a lot of corporate interest. We have local interest. We have federalism. We have a lot of religion. We have all of these sorts of things working throughout the country. We need a very powerful, consolidated central government to recreate this unity broken by an ill-defined constitution. So we'll remake the constitutional order. And then most of that power is really going to be lodged in the executive branch, right? The idea of judicial review and things that happened in this country in the mid-20th century, I think, came along as something of a surprise, as an ongoing project of progressivism dialectically, rearticulating itself. We all need to, as Yuval Levin's wonderful new book, American Covenant, he says the progressives are really the first integralists, if you follow this kind of intra-Catholic debate we've been having the past 10 years. Why are they the first integralists? Because we're all supposed to think and act in the same way. That's Woodrow Wilson. But how's the progressive constitution going? Relatedly, we have the hyper-individualist or hyper-liberal constitution. This is the constitution similarly leaves no room for states to govern themselves, certainly not in any countercultural sense of enforcing moral regulations regarding abortion, family, religion, pornography. Why? Because all we have in politics is contracting and consenting individuals who have no real inbuilt limits and contents to their choices. This is a constitution that provides individuals a wide berth of freedom via natural rights that are in the 9th Amendment, that are incorporated in the 14th Amendment against states and localities. And it all seems very American, and this embodiment of liberal thinking about rights. This Constitution is devised solely in the interest of the rights of individuals based on the unrealistic abstraction of unrelated, autonomous individuals, divorced from the privileges and responsibilities of parenthood, of being creatures, of being citizens. So this type of constitutionalism, I would argue, isn't political enough, if we think about Bronson's categories, to be the foundation of any government. And it isn't relational enough to properly articulate the limits of government with the family or religion in mind. And ultimately, the goal is to reconfigure every feature of human life by an individualism that pushes us in the direction of what Pierre Monod, the French political theorist, calls a post-political, post-familial, and post-religious fantasy world that would make republicanism unsustainable. We also have emerging arguments for a post-liberal constitution, primarily founded by what I call kind of Catholic rejectionists of the American founding. They share tremendous commonality with progressivism and the need to use power and to control it to forge national unity, and similarly argue that much of our American founding is just no good. It's rooted in a liberalism, and liberalism at any speed is decadent and individualistic. Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, other voices very prominent in this regard. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Okay, so I won't. I think most of you probably are aware of kind of what's going on there. But just some concluding thoughts. The progressive constitution is running on fumes, it seems to me. Can we continue to live in the conditions of its political atheism, of incessant tax and spending, of a regulation that is incredibly heavy-handed, if not lawless? And if we continue in this vein, what happens? What happens to us as constitutional beings? What happens to us in our economic lives and also in our religious lives? And then there's ongoing question of what is the entitlement state doing to us in any conception of free citizenship, which is surely the worst effect of the welfare state. The hyper-individualistic constitution seems also, to my mind, now, as I say, it's running out of speed. As Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in a good nation, but social breakdown seems manifest to me, so I don't know what that really builds on going forward. What I do think we have is truth of human nature, the way Brownson articulates it. We are relational, embodied persons who come to government with pre-political obligations that we have to fulfill to flourish. Government should not inhibit these, but should encourage them. So this means we are free for family, for religion, for economics, and for communities. This is what we might think of as a libertarian means for non-libertarian ends. So a policy program of large amounts of economic, educational freedom, so that we can flourish, not as to be free for free's sake, but freedom in pre-liberal institutions. We also need to adopt a political belief that institutions matter and that our history as a Republican people matters. So we need to teach again and create the educational freedom to teach and learn again about our civilization and our country and our Constitution. Deliberation is also key here. A Republican people who wish to live free and responsible lives must talk, argue, and settle with one another in and through the institutions designed for the task. There is a reason why progressivism and hyperliberalism flourish in the judiciary and the administrative state. Ideology there can be imposed on top of citizens who disagree with it. So we need to restore the founders' constitution in another sense. And this also entails that we have to cease promoting or winking at a narcissistic and vacuous liberalism that does not create space for and exalt the relational person whose freedom has a rich and truthful set of ends and content. Thank you.